I was diagnosed with breast cancer just about a year ago, and initially I was told I needed a mammogram and so on to determine, and an ultrasound, and they determined that I had definite, or what appeared to be breast cancer, and also involvement in 3 to 5 lymph nodes in the armpit. So it had spread to the lymph system. And then following that, I had more analysis and eventually had a PET scan. And the PET scan showed that I had not just stage 1, 2, and 3, but stage 4. It had also spread to the low spine, I think L1 and 2, and the upper spine, T7, 6, 7, and also there was a spot in the pelvis and the sternum, and and that the large cancer tumor in the breast and the lymph area was very active, and that was stage 4, and I opted not to take any chemo or medication at that time. That was last fall in, say, October, November. And I changed my diet and did some very healthy things for the next 4, 5, 6 months. In February I had another PET scan, and or I didn't have a PET scan, but I went into the doctor, and the tumor had grown by, I think, 25% in my breast, the visible tumor. So it was determined that things were becoming worse, and I would need to take some kind of other action. So I decided, I considered going to Switzerland, I considered going to Germany, I considered Mexico, and ultimately I decided to stay in the United States. I was pretty tired at that point, and I instead opted to go to the Cancer Treatment Centers of America in Chicago, where they have their hospital specializes a little bit in breast cancer at that location. So they flew me to Chicago and did a PET scan, and they determined that the cancer was in the bones as stated, and that everything was a little bit worse. And they recommended to me, after me believing for 5 days there that I would be put on chemo, they believed that I could begin with hormone therapy. So I began taking 2 shots, one in each butt, of Faslodex, and also orally taking anastrozole, and that was a daily pill. So I began to do that, with the protocol being to return to CTA in 2 weeks and have another set of shots, continuing the anastrozole by mouth. And then in 2 more weeks after that, another return to Chicago and 2 more shots. And at that point I would be at what they called the therapeutic dose of the Faslodex. And then I would only return to Chicago once a month. So 2 weeks after the first set of shots, I returned to CTCA in Chicago and had the second set of shots. By that time, I was quite sick. I was already coughing. I had complete laryngitis. I had been diagnosed with bronchitis, but they thought it was non-bacterial. And I got the second set of shots and began to do some more research on the medications I was taking, with the intention of returning to CTCA 2 more weeks to get the third set of shots. In the interim 2-week period, I came to Washington, the Washington area, to visit a friend of mine for 40 years. And while here, I had the opportunity to have a consultation with Dr. Young, and he had agreed to see me tentatively during the time that I was in Washington before I returned to CTCA in 2 weeks. So at that point I was really quite sick. I was coughing and couldn't sleep well, and my lungs were heavy, and I was altogether feeling exhausted and worn out and looked quite sick, of course. So Dr. Young began treatments, and within one day there was a change, and within a couple of days there was a significant change in the size of the tumor in the right breast, which we could palpitate. And so by the time the end of that first week had gone by, I had developed double pneumonia after 4 or 5 days as a result of what I believe to be the side effects to the medications, because one of the medications had a side effect of cold symptoms. And when I called Chicago about the fact that I felt that I had double pneumonia, that my lungs felt like I got stabbed every time I coughed, and were beginning to hurt every time I breathed, they wanted to put me on an antibiotic, which I was not for a number of reasons, involving the immune system and killing off the gut flora, and not wanting to compromise my immune system any further, but knowing that I needed to do something. And so they called in an antibiotic for me, and Dr. Young at the same time said he was able to treat pneumonia. So over the next 2 or 3 days he treated the pneumonia. I never did take the antibiotic, and cleared up the pneumonia, and I stayed in Virginia, and I was due to return to Chicago the following week. At that point I became very concerned about continuing the medications with the terrible side effects I was having, and I also was having excellent results here with no negative side effects. Everything was on the mend. I was feeling better, and Dr. Young agreed to continue to treat me, so I opted to stay here for an additional 20-day treatment of daily treatments of the acupuncture. So eventually the next 20 days were up, and I continued again with the acupuncture treatments. When I had the blood work done in Chicago in March, the initial blood work done, my cancer markers, which are evidence of tumor activity in the body, were both over 200. One was 202 and one was 207, rounding up. And so we were getting close to my next visit to Chicago for a PET scan. I continued with Dr. Young through the end of June and returned to Chicago the last week of June, had another PET scan and more blood work. The PET scan showed that the breast and the lymph area of my armpit was completely clear of cancer. There was no red. My pelvis was clear, my low spine was clear, and that there were 2 remaining cancer tumor lesions in the bones, one in the sternum and one in the T7 spine. And the cancer markers had gone down from the 200 numbers, 202 went down to 54, and 207 went down to 75. That was a significant change in the reduction in the tumor activity. So I opted at that point to continue with Dr. Young, and I continued with him and had recent blood work. It's now the last week of August, and the marker that was once 202 and then became 54 has gone down to 53, and the marker that was 207 and went down to 75 has gone down to 69. So there continues to be motion, improvement in that number. It's the 3rd week of August. My energy has improved significantly. I now go up and down stairs. When I arrived here, I did not have the energy to walk down the hallway practically. I was quite weak. Now I'm using the stairs on a daily basis. I'm feeling much more awake and alert and conscious and capable, and have an overall improvement in my well-being that is significant in my ability to think and see and move and everything. So I'm extremely pleased about this progress. And that's where we are right now.
CTC. Are you going
Oh, I'll be returning to CTCA in another month for another PET scan, and that's what would be the next evaluation.